Okay, here we go. Happy Chanukah, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. This is, I think, a very meaningful opportunity for us here tonight. Chanukah is a wonderful, very special holiday. We reflect on the special miracles of Hashem that happened during the Chanukah story. But another important aspect of Chanukah is to remember the tremendous devotion of the Jews at a time where so many Jews were wandering off the path of observant Judaism. The Chashmonoim and many with them in the Chanukah story really strengthened themselves in their service of God. And in addition to being a time to think about the remarkable miracles that God brought the Jewish people, Chanukah is also a time to think about how we can learn from them. Not necessarily learn from them to wage a war, but learn from the Chashmonoim, from the Maccabees, and so many others during the time about how to strengthen ourselves in our devotion to God. And we thought it would be a nice idea to have a panel discussion to talk about inspiration. I'm very grateful to each of our panelists. My goal is to speak very little this evening. If I gave a full appropriate introduction for each of our panelists, I would be speaking a great deal this evening. So I'm really just going to give an extremely brief context for each person. Thank God these are known people within our community. And if you don't know them so well and you want to know more about them, Google them. I experimented today. There's a lot on each of them if you Google them on the web. Without further ado, I'll introduce them in the order that they'll share ideas with us tonight. Mrs. Sharon Frandell has taught and inspired adults and children of all ages over decades within the Jewish community. She currently is the managing director of the Jewish Education Innovation Challenge, fusing her wonderful years of experience in education with a tremendous spirit of creativity. We're so glad she can join us this evening. Rabbi Ari Koretzky is the executive director of Ma'or at Maryland, which is an outreach organization working at the University of Maryland College Park campus. It is remarkable to think about how many members of our community today were introduced to Orthodox Judaism by Rabbi Koretzky and his associates. We're so glad he can join us this evening. Mrs. Lianne Heller is the executive director of Sulam, which is a vital special education inclusion program within our community. Sulam has made a remarkable difference for so many of our community's children. And I should add, has also been a great opportunity for those who don't need special education within the community to befriend those who are in need of special education and learn about them and learn from them. And we're so glad that Mrs. Heller can join us tonight. And finally, Rabbi Dr. Lerner has worked in the Jewish community as a pulpit rabbi and educator over decades. In addition to being a clinical and industrial psychologist, he speaks to and advises individuals and organizations in the Jewish community and beyond. We're so honored that he could join us this evening. And I think the evening promises to be inspirational in its own right and certainly enlightening. Without further ado, I just want to pose the opening question, then we'll ask each of the presenters to share about this. The question is, could each of the presenters please share a story about someone with whom they have worked, from whom they witnessed true growth and change? And presumably from that, this is something we can all think about and reflect on. And Mrs. Freundel, we'll begin with you, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you for this opportunity. When I was thinking about inspiring people, it actually kept coming back to not someone I worked with, but the person who inspired me in my life more than anyone else and caused me to become, Baruch Hashem, the person I am today. And that's my mother. So I want to tell you about not one situation, but one person experiencing inspiring growth and change throughout her own life. My mother, of blessed memory, was a Holocaust survivor. She and her parents were deported to Poland, and eventually they made their way to England. They lived in London, where she spent the war in the north of England because they evacuated all the kids during the Blitzkrieg. And she returned home after the war when she was around 16 and became a balas tshuva before that popular term was even coined. Although her grandparents were Shomrei mitzvot, her parents had given up all ritual observance. When the war was over and she was back in London, she would walk from Grosvenor Square, where they lived, to Golders Green, about 5 miles or a 2-hour walk each way, to attend TVI, Torah Vavodah Institute, which was a precursor to Bnei Akiva. She married my father at the age of 22. She moved to the north of England, and then Denver, and then New York, and then Baltimore to follow my father's jobs. She sacrificed a whole lot to send my brother and me to Jewish day school. But she always said that the one desire in her life was that all of her descendants should be shleimim, from Jews. And Baruch Hashem, her 2 children, her 8 grandchildren, and so far, over a dozen great-grandchildren are all living from lives. Quite a remarkable feat in today's day and age. But part of the reason for that is the model she set for us. She worked in Jewish communal service. She taught Hebrew school, and she worked at the Baltimore Hebrew College as an executive assistant. It had always bothered her that she had never gone to college, but there was a war on at the time. So she went back to get her AA degree when she was in her 50s. After I was grown and out of the house, my parents moved to the New York area, and she worked her way up the ranks of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. But she was not finished with her pursuits yet. She decided that she wanted to do chesed that perhaps others couldn't do, and she spoke fluent English, German, Yiddish, and Hebrew. So she went to clown school, and in her 70s, she became a clown so that she could go into nursing homes to entertain the residents in their mother tongues, because as they got older, they all went back to the mama lashon, and she could talk to each of them in the language that was easiest for them. And I remember when 9/11 hit, she was 74 years old, and she was still working at the JDC in Manhattan. And they had closed the bridges out of the city, so she couldn't get home to New Jersey. And I finally got a hold of her around 4 or 5 that afternoon. And I said, "What are you going to do?" And with total calm in her voice, she said, "What's the big deal? I'll order in Chinese food and I'll sleep on the sofa in the office. I'll be fine." She never lost her faith, and it only strengthened throughout her life. I remember as a child asking her where God was during the Holocaust. She said, "He was with us." I said, "How can you say that?" And she responded, "I'm standing here, aren't I?" And this from a woman who lost her entire family aside from her parents. People often talk about simple faith. Her faith wasn't simple at all. It was very complex. She argued with God when she thought that something was not right, while at the same time she accepted whatever life dished out to her. When she was nifter, I took her 2 Sidurim. She had her weekday Siddur and her Shabbat Siddur. And in her weekday Siddur, on the page of the Amidah with Rifa'enu, the bracha, the blessing for healing, I found a long handwritten list of those she davened for every day. Some of the names crossed out, some clearly added at different times, some deleted and then added back in. She was a true believer in the grace of God and in the power of tefillah. Even towards the end of her life, when I would call her each morning and ask her how she was, she would say, "Baruch Hashem, nishtega, thank God, not worse," or "Baruch Hashem maleit, thank God I'm alive." And the Baruch Hashem was never pro forma. She really meant that she wanted to bless God as he had seen fit to give her another day on this earth. She was the single greatest exemplar of inspiring spiritual growth throughout her life that I have ever encountered in my lifetime.
So much. Thank you so much. That was really beautiful. Rabbi Koretsky, if you could please share a portrait of someone that you've seen truly grow. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Now you can hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'd much rather cede my time to Mrs. Freundel and hear more stories about her mother, but I'll jump in. That's really amazing. I wish I had had the privilege to meet her. So I want to share two stories that are, I think to me, highlight the underappreciated, but very real precipitators of true growth. I think there's a great misconception by those involved in education or not involved in education about kind of the sometimes an overstatement, I think, of the role that we can play, and often perhaps missing the boat on other factors that play into the equation. And the first story goes like this. It's about 12 years ago, and there was a woman who would call me all the time to tell me that I have a niece and she goes to the University of Maryland, and I want you to meet her and I want you to bring her in and get her involved and connect her to Judaism. This woman is observant, and she herself is a Baal Tshuva, and her family was not, and this niece is on campus, and she's very sincerely and earnestly yearning for her family member to see the light, so to speak, as she did. And I never really had the heart to tell her, it's very nice you want me to reach out to your niece, but it's not so simple to, randomly pick out a name and then go say, hey, your religious aunt, who you probably think is crazy, wants me to find you and educate you. So I always kind of was very polite and, just humored her. In fact, it's funny because this happens from time to time. There's another guy who calls me all the time, and every few months he calls me up and says, "Oh, did you meet my nephew yet?" So it's very well meaning, but I tell him the same thing. Like, what do you want me to do? How am I supposed to meet this guy in a normal way? So anyway, this woman called me every number of months, and then finally, there's a special fair every year where all of the clubs and all of the different groups on campus hawk their wares and put out a table, and hundreds, really thousands of kids walk by, and you can try to meet new students. And it was that day of the year. And that morning I got a call from this woman, and she said, I just want to remind you, my niece is there and you need to meet her. Okay, we'll try my best, Within a few minutes, no more than an hour, standing at that table, this young woman walks by, and I meet her and sign her up. Of course, I couldn't say anything to her without freaking her out. And I told her I eventually told myself I'll tell her the story at her Shavuot brachas, which I don't know if I held out quite that long. I told her the story later on, but many years later. And the lesson there, of course, to me is that it's nothing to do with me. This is a woman who's davening for her niece, and of course, I'm cynically sort of patronizing her and kind of dismissive and just humoring her. And the reality is, of course, that it's those tefillos, it's that, whether it's the schus avos or tefillos, but it's that spiritual impact undoubtedly that played a major role, the major role, I think, in that scenario. And we're just there as a conduit. It becomes like, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but trying not to ruin the process. Second story is one of my favorites. It's I was in Manhattan a number of years ago. I was there for a conference for people running birthright trips. We run lots of different trips through our organization, and one of the types of trips that we run is birthright trips to Israel. And we go, I had to go in for this conference for different people leading a trip. So I was on the Vamoose bus back from Manhattan to Bethesda. And my wife will always tell you, it's probably unsurprising to people who know me, that when I speak on the phone, when I speak most times, I tend to be rather voluble. I'm not great at speaking quietly. And again, if you know me, you're probably not shocked at this point. Rabbi Rosenbaum, contain your shock. I understand. And I was talking on the phone with somebody about the conference. I was talking about birthright and Israel, those kinds of topics. And the guy in a row in front of me kind of peeks his head back and says, "Did you say birthright?" I said, "Yeah, birthright." He said, "Oh, because I went on birthright." And say, "Great." And we started chatting a little bit, like kind of through the seats. And eventually it was like getting very annoying for both of our seatmates. So we switched and we actually, sat next to each other, and we schmoozed the entire ride home, which is, again, although I tend to be an extrovert, but actually on bus rides or plane rides, I like to be an introvert. So this was a big mysterious nefesh for me, but we schmoozed the entire 4.5 hours all the way to Bethesda. And at the end we exchanged numbers, and I connected him to, he was a little bit older, he was in his 20s, not in the college age. Connected him to Rabbi Teitelbaum, who works with young professionals, also lives in our community in White Oak. I'm sure many of you know him. And before you know it, within a year or two, this young man became observant. And I went to his wedding a few years later in Manhattan. He married a very, very amazing young woman, doctor in Hopkins now. And he just told me they moved back to New York, and they have an incredible story how they met, actually, which is for another time. But an amazing story, just such, happenstance, so to speak. And again, there, the message to me was sort of the second prong of the bubble bursting when it comes to educators and maybe the self-inflation that I might indulge sometimes. And that is that so much of the work is really contingent on an individual's bechira, an individual's desire to take those steps. And as much as, the terms go around that, I made so-and-so religious, or whatever sort of phraseology that often gets thrown about in a casual way, really is a complete misnomer. And I think in many ways undermines the very hard work and real courage that people display when they make real changes. Because I tell people all the time, I teach the same classes or give the same spiel to most people. It's not like I have a special spiel for the people that end up growing, discernibly. It's just those are the people that actually chose to embrace it and to exercise their free will to develop themselves and to go in a particular direction. And so, again, when we look at outreach, education, influence, between the power of tefillah, the power of Hashem's influence in this sphere, and the reality that people have to make their own choices, and coercion isn't really even possible, as much as we'd like to flatter ourselves to think that it might be. People are making their own choices, and I think both those factors a little bit diminish maybe perhaps diminish the ego of the educator, but it's also empowering, because it's not about me at the end of the day. It's about the Rabbanu Shalom. It's about those that we're touching, those that we're connecting with. And if I can keep those two lessons in mind, I'll be a lot more successful and also a lot happier. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Mrs. Heller, a portrait of someone who's undergone significant growth and change. I'm sorry, if you unmute yourself. It's not, let's see, hold on. I'm sorry. You're not able to unmute yourself. Hold on. Maybe try now. Wait, okay, one more time. Now try.
Did it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's really a great honor to be sitting alongside such an illustrious panel. So I want to tell you a story about a student at Sulam. I actually spoke to him this evening and got his permission to speak about him and use his name. His name is Mike. He was a student at Sulam who entered the program in 9th grade. He had been at a public school for students with Asperger's syndrome right through middle school, and his parents decided that they wanted him to re-enter the Jewish community and get the support he needed to be academically, socially, and emotionally successful in a Jewish community school. So we had the great pleasure of receiving Mike at Sulam in 9th grade. Let me describe this young man. He was tall, he was broad, he was taller and bigger than just about every single person in the school, including all the teachers. He has and had a shock of fiery red hair and a fiery personality to match. And as big as he was physically, he had an intellect that exceeded even his size. Quite frankly, Mike is absolutely brilliant, but his social skills did not match his size or his brilliance. He simply couldn't navigate the social world, and all he wanted to do was to have friends. He wanted to be liked. He wanted to be welcomed and included just like everyone else. And in addition, and by his own admission, and quite vociferously so, he did not appreciate being thrust into a school that had expectations for davening, for Judaic studies, and he simply didn't want any part of that. So at Sulam, we had our work cut out for us. We also believe at Sulam that our students benefit most when they come to terms with their diagnosis. And, research tells us that owning your diagnosis promotes self-advocacy and self-knowledge. But Mike really struggled to confront that and to talk about it. He could barely talk about it. And this was a really big challenge for him. He struggled throughout his school career up until that point and even beyond, feeling less than, feeling marginalized, feeling left out. As a person with an invisible disability, and I'll tell you a little bit more later about the difference between invisible and visible disabilities, he was often judged unfairly and he was simply misunderstood, and he had a pretty negative experience in school. So the job of the team at Sulam was to provide Mike with not only the tools he needed to be successful in socializing, but to show him that he was a deeply valued member of the community, that we all cared about him, that his talents and his skills were appreciated, and that we understood him. And it was a rocky road for Mike. But by the end of his high school experience, Mike was able to record a video for a large audience. And this is, think about it, this is after really struggling to own his diagnosis, just feeling a lot of shame. By the end of his high school career, he was able to record a video for a large audience about his trajectory at Sulam. He was able to openly state his diagnosis of autism. He was able to own his social struggles and tell his story of growth and success publicly. You can imagine that this was a moment that the entire team at Sulam celebrated actually with tears of joy. But that's not the end of Mike's story. Remember how Mike rejected Judaics at school? Well, apart from going on a 10-day mission to Israel with Berman Hebrew Academy, where he deeply identified with Israel, its history and its struggles, something that he hadn't done before, he also ended up going to Israel for a year before starting an honors program at Towson University. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, I spoke with Mike just this evening, and he told me that he's currently learning once a week at Hillel. Sure, he added that he gets paid to do this, but he admitted that he would do it without pay. He says that he feels deeply connected to his Jewish roots and to learning, and in his words, will always feel this way. He attributed this to his time throughout high school participating in NCSY programming, where he associated, in his words, good, fun things with Jewish things. So this story of growth and progress is one that so many people can celebrate, starting with Mike himself, who is an introspective, reflective, and all-round amazing human being. We can celebrate with Mike's parents, who really were determined to put him in a Jewish environment, in spite of his, fighting back against it. I think that we can celebrate the work done at Sulam, the work done by Berman and Berman's mission to Israel. I think NCSY deserves a lot of credit, and Hillel and all those people around Mike who never, ever gave up on him. That's really my story of growth and inspiration in one of our students that I'm expecting to continue to learn more and more about as time goes on. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Rabbi Lerner?
Hi there. I want to thank those who preceded me. And I was thinking about one of my mentors, who is known in this community, is Rabbi Emanuel Feldman. And interestingly enough, a number of years ago, when Rabbi Emanuel Feldman was a scholar in residence in my shul in Cape Town, so he had just written a book called Tales Out of Shul. And the great tales were not in the book, but nevertheless, there's one thing that resonates for me, and it was something that he had said to me personally, and that is that you never know how the story is going to end. And when I think about the Atlanta that Rabbi Emanuel Feldman came to in 1953, and the Atlanta and the Beth Jacob congregation that you go to today, you never know how the story is going to end. So with that in mind, I will get to my story, but as the speakers before me were saying some amazing things, so combining a little bit of what Rabbi Karetsky said and a little bit of what Sharon Frandell said. So again, back in Cape Town, one of the scholars in residence who came on a number of occasions was the late, great Rabbi Avram Yeshua Twersky, an unbelievable human being, incredible. And so whenever he would come, we would have a Shabbaton, and there would be a Friday night dinner, Shabbos lunch, a tish, everything. So we're in this packed luncheon room. Rabbi Twersky is sitting next to me. And on Shabbos, Rabbi Twersky, I mean, he always looked pretty Jewish, but like on Shabbos, he looked really seriously Jewish. We're talking about the Bekisha, the Shrama, the whole thing, okay? Which wasn't all that common in my shul in Cape Town. It wasn't every day, So he was sitting next to me, and this man comes up, and I knew the fellow, and I'm sitting next to Rabbi Twersky, but the guy looks straight at me. And he says, Rabbi, I don't understand something. I'm not religious. My wife's not religious. My parents aren't religious. Her parents aren't religious. And I don't know any religious people in our family. And we have a son who is so incredibly religious. How does such a thing happen? And I was thinking, I'm glad Rabbi Twersky's sitting here, because how do you answer a question like that? Like if you ask me something about kasher Shabbat, how do you answer? Now, without missing a beat, nothing. Rabbi Twersky looks the man dead in the eye, and he says, for centuries and centuries, Babas would pray every Friday night for their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, all the generations that would come later. Your son is the direct product of the prayers of a Bubba in the Hain. So with that in mind, and with what Rabbi Koretzky said, which I think is very, very profound, and that is that it's not so much what the Makarev does as much as being in the right place at the right time to connect that person's neshama to the eternity that was meant to be. Just like Rabbi Tursky mentioned that this young man was the product of prayers that came from Bubba's who knows when. So it is that, I'll close with this, that when our first assignment, when Arlita and I started out, was in Wilmington, Delaware, which was once known as the capital of the diaspora. There was only one sort of Orthodox shul there. And I was the education youth director there. And in those days, Rabbi Rosenbaum, Rabbi Karetsky, this is a little bit older than your general, but in those days, when we go back, a lot of Jews who came to shul on Yom Kippur did not wear tennis shoes or soft shoes. There were a lot of Jews who came to Orthodox shoes that were wearing leather shoes. I mean, it was just like you got dressed up and you went. So you could count like, and this was a big shul. This was Adas, and it was a big Adas MS in Wilmington. Big shul, Yom Kippur packed. There's hardly any tennis shoes around. Anyway, it was during Yisker break. I'm standing on the parking lot, and there was a time, Rabbi Koretzky, I'm telling you, there was a time I was young and cool. I know it's hard to believe, but there was a time. You can ask Arlita, I was fairly cool. Not as cool as she was, but I was cool. And so I was standing on the parking lot during Yisker with a bunch of kids gathered around me, but the parking lot was full of people wearing leather shoes, you know, whatever. And I'm wearing, in those days, you didn't have tennis shoes like today that came with automatic transmissions and radios and defoggers and the whole thing, you know. In those days, a tennis shoe was a simple shoe, you know, simple, easy shoe. So I'm wearing my tennis shoes and they're white, which was the traditional color of tennis shoes, white and black. Anyway, coming down the road in their car is a family, a father and a grandfather, a mother, and two boys in the back. The family is driving on Yom Kippur. They don't observe very much, but they know they got to go to shul on Yom Kippur, and they're actually late for Yisker. The reason that they're coming to shul is to get there for Yisker. Anyway, in the car, this discussion is taking place that the grandfather is telling his grandsons they need to wear tennis shoes on Yom Kippur. Like, what? What? These kids, they were 13 and 15 years old. They did not wish to be uncool. Like, do you realize how uncool it was in Wilmington to be 13, 14, 15 years old and wear tennis shoes? So that they were rejecting it completely. So finally, the grandfather works on the younger one who's 13 and says, and by the way, $5 in those days was a fair amount of money. Grandfather pulls out $5 on Yom Kippur, gives it to the 13-year-old and says, I brought your tennis shoes. If you wear these, you can have the $5. Now, don't ask me how this all, okay. So the kid, being a fairly wise kid, figures, look, I'll be embarrassed for $5. You know, adjusted for inflation, it's probably $50 today. Anyway, so I'm standing on the parking lot and I see this kid come across the parking lot wearing tennis shoes. I figure the only from kid in the city. So he looks at me and he wants to stand next to me because he doesn't want to be the only person not wearing tennis shoes. And he's standing next to the cool guy who's with the other kids. So I put my arm around him, and that was the beginning of a journey for that young man that today has him living on Yeshiva Lane, and he's part of the administration of Ner Yisrael, and his children are all Talmidei Chachamim. And when his father and grandfather, and father passed away, and they were buried in Wilmington, attending their funerals were the Rosh HaYeshivas of Ner Yisrael And the entire entourage was made up of Talmidei Chachamim. You never know how the story's going to end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, wow, that was amazing. The next question for the panelists is, if a person's looking inward, not looking at someone else, looking at themselves, trying to bring about growth and change for themselves. Person is inspired by things tonight or other times, they want to become a different person. If you had to pinpoint one thing that this is the key ingredient to help oneself grow, what would you say to a person trying to become a person of greater growth? Mrs. Frandell?
There are a few things that are all connected. First of all, never lose your sense of humor. You know, a lot of these stories had funny elements in them tonight because there's something funny everywhere, right? We said this morning in Hallel, Zeh hayom asah Hashem nagila v'nismacha bo, right? This is the day God made. Let us rejoice in it. But never lose your sense of humor and never lose your bitachon. And to quote my mother, she used to say all the time, bitachon doesn't mean that things turn out the way you want. Bitachon means that you know that he knows what he's doing. That'll get you through an awful lot if you know that he knows what he's doing. For myself, I have a mission statement in my life. And the mission statement is the penultimate pasuk in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes. Sof davar hakol nishma et Elokim yira v'et mitzvotav shmar ki zeh kol ha'adam. When all is said and done, revere God and fulfill his mitzvot, for this is the totality of the human being. Make each day productive for your own neshama, that's Yirat Hashem, and for the world at large, that's et mitzvotav shmar. And as you lay your head down to sleep each night, ask yourself, did I do something today to elevate my own neshama? And did I do something today to make the world a better place, whether writ large or just showing a kindness to an individual? And I think that will help each of us continue on our own spiritual journey with growth throughout our lives.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Rabbi Koretsky, what would you say is the core for a person's own personal growth?
Okay, I keep having the difficult challenge of going right after Mrs. Freundel and just trying to process what she's saying. You know, there's a famous Drashas Haran that says, Im yadati vayiti, he's talking about God, saying if I knew God, I would be God. So I think if I knew the answer to this question, I would embody the answer to this question. How do I, affect spiritual growth or change? If I have to pick one ingredient, I guess it's kind of like the guy who gets wishes, and he makes the wish for unlimited wishes. I know that's against the rules, technically, in most wishing scenarios, but the equivalent to that in this case, I believe, would be resilience. That we give up on ourselves fairly quickly, and even if that's a year or years, as long as we're still breathing and our heart is still beating, and we live to fight another day, we can continue to change. We can continue to grow, and our window, and I'm sure some of my co-panelists, Rabbi Dr. Lerner, you opened the door to making age jokes, so I could, I feel like I could walk right through it now. But I'm slightly younger than at least that one member of the panel. But I'm sure they would say that you look at life from a much larger window and the context of decades and decades, and people change, maybe glacially. But people do change over time if they're invested in it, if they're committed to it. And our time, and I'm saying this as a highly impatient person. One of my great flaws is my impatience. And I know that the reality is that over time you get up again and try again and try again. And that's what we say every L, people are giving the same speeches and the same exhortations, and people are feeling despondent every year because am I going to be different this year? Am I going to be different this year? And the reality is maybe only imperceptibly, but if I continue fighting that battle, if I continue down the path year after year after year, I'll look back eventually and I'll see how much of a mountain I've climbed if I put one foot in front of the other. And that resilience means that whatever I'm working on, I have no license to abdicate that voyage, to abdicate that journey. I have my responsibility as long as I'm here is to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And if I just do that, then a lot of good will happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Mrs. Heller?
Thank you. The ingredient for inspiring growth and change in ourselves. So I think that there are so many important ingredients. First of all, one very important one is positive self-talk. With humility, of course. I think we all struggle with our own personal judge. I think we can easily sabotage ourselves by thinking negative thoughts, thinking that we can't, it's not possible, and allowing circumstances to do us in, right? We can tell ourselves all sorts of untruths. I think most people don't even know they are doing this to themselves. So becoming aware of our self-talk and evaluating it by asking yourself if you would say some of the things that you say to yourself to other people. And my bet is that very often the answer would be no. I think that change is one of the hardest things to do. We have habits that we form that have been formed by neural pathways. I imagine a rock that has been shaped by a trickle of water over hundreds of years. That's just like how a habit is formed. They become instinctual, and we have to go against an instinct, which is like going against gravity. It takes real effort and concentration. So I'm saying it's really difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible. Some people say you have to commit to a goal for a straight 21 days. And after 3 weeks, the pursuit of that goal should become a habit. And then you have to intentionally practice that habit for a straight 90 days. So that's a lot of commitment and a lot of intentional work. And I do believe that people can do it. I think most important, though, is that people take small bites, take out a small goal, take small steps, and then trust the process. For myself, on a very personal note, I can say that I struggle with conflict. I don't like it. It makes me anxious, and sometimes in my work, it is actually unavoidable. I'm working in a Jewish day school. Conflict happens. So typically when I'm confronted with a situation where I know I'm entering a conflict, I've trained myself in a new habit to focus, to actually stop, to pause. Sometimes I'll even close my office door. I'll close the blinds, and I will sit down in my chair and I will close my eyes. And I will deeply focus on the other person and think about all of their strengths, all of their goodness, all the wonder that they bring to the world. And then when I enter a conversation where conflict was expected, I find that it is done with deep respect for one another, with dignity. We may never agree, but we always walk away feeling valued and respected by one another. This is something that I've been practicing of late, and I've really found a lot of strength in it. The last and most important ingredient for me is my connection with Hashem. I deeply trust that God is there for me and will help me through any difficulty or challenge. And to quote Rabbi Ari, Alav Shalom, everything that happens is for the good. I deeply believe that. It's just not always obviously so. We don't always have to see it. Accepting that Hashem has a plan gives me the strength I need on my journey in life.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Rabbi Lerner?
So we learn aseh lecha rav u'keneh lecha chaver. So it's very important for us to have a rabbi who is a chaver as well. And it's important for all of us, rabbis, all of us, to have that rabbi, that person, that inspiration throughout our lives. So throughout my life, I've always tried to find those individuals who inspire me on a regular basis to be the best that I can be. So it was, for me, very hard this past year when one of those people, Rabbi Dr. Abraham Twersky, passed away, because on a personal level, an enormous inspiration, just beyond. But one of the people who I always relied upon from my years, going back into my years in the Rabbanis, was Rabbi Herman Naftali Neuberger from Ner Yisrael, who together with Rav Ruderman founded Ner Yisrael. Rabbi Neuberger was one of the most brilliant men. I just tactically brilliant and insightfully brilliant. And one night when I was a Rav in South Africa, so during the winter there, which was the summer here, Arlita and I would make a trip back to the States to visit family. And I would have a meeting with Rabbi Neuberger, and the only time we could meet quietly was between 12 midnight and 2 in the morning in his rather humble apartment on Yeshiva Lane. And sitting there one night with him, I was kind of overwhelmed by something we were discussing. And I said to him, I called him Rabbi, when the history of the 20th century Jewry is written, only then will the things that Rebbe has done become known to the world. And he looked at me and he reached over and he said to me, it's not about all of those things that you think people know about. That's not it. Your job is to stop bad things from happening. Nobody knows about that except the Eibishter. Nobody knows about that. Your job is to stop bad things from happening. I remember Rabbi Neuberger every single day, because every single day I am tasked with trying to stop bad things from happening. Sometimes I succeed and sometimes I fail. Rabbi Neuberger was a great inspiration for me and remains a great inspiration. Rabbi Twersky, Rabbi Emanuel Feldman. I'm fortunate that I have such people. Earlier this evening, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with Rabbi Shraga Feivel Zimmerman. He was for many years the Gateshead Rav, and now he's the Av Bezdin of the Federation of London. He's a hero of mine. There are just certain people who are just like people come to us and want us to inspire them. We also have to find the people who inspire us to keep us in the game.
Thank you very much. One more question on this topic of inspiration. All the panelists are people who through various aspects of their professional lives and otherwise have been inspiring people along the lines, like Rabbi Lerner said, many people are looking to all of you. But everyone here has people in their lives that they would like to help grow. It could be family members, it could be friends, it could be someone they meet on the street. What we just spoke about, the core ingredient to one's own growth and change. What would you say, or maybe you would say it's the same thing, but what would you say would be the core ingredient to help someone else grow and change? Mrs. Freundel?
Rabbi Karetsky alluded to his impatience with himself. And I think it's perfectly legitimate for us to be impatient with ourselves. But when we're trying to help somebody else grow and change, patience is key. Everyone is different. Every neshama is unique, right? Bishvili nivra ha'olam. And everyone goes at their own pace. And everyone resonates to something different. Some people grow through intellectual engagement, some through emotional engagement, some through spiritual engagement. There are people who love the Ruach Minyan. There are people who find davening meaningful with no singing at all. Everybody's got to find their own path. And if we're to help someone else, we need to show that person not only patience, but empathy. And empathy means that we need to understand that each person needs to do it his or her own way, not my way. And if I really want to help someone grow, I need to draw out of them what would help them and then give them what they would need, not what I would need under the same circumstances.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Koretzky, you're doing a great job of following Mrs. Freundel, so we're going to ask you to follow Mrs. Freundel again. Wait, I'm sorry. Now try it. Are you able to unmute? Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah,
Yes,
thank you.
It's not an easy task, but I'm trying my best. So first of all, I appreciate Mrs. Freundel's point about patience, because I think that's very much tied to the notion of ego that I was speaking about before. And if it's about me, then I need it to happen now. I need it to happen yesterday. If it's about them, then that's their journey. I think people often ask me, what are the most important qualities to be involved in outreach in Kiruv? And I like to say two things, two qualities. Number one, Avos Yisrael. A person has to love other Jews. A person has to care for other Jews. Really, it's Avos Hashem. Also, according the Rambam talks about that we love Hashem, we love other people. It's all intertwined, but we have to want to open the doors that I spoke about earlier, that people have give people the chance to walk through those doors, but we have to want to open them. It makes me, very sad when I look around and see sometimes that people aren't even interested in opening the doors for people that aren't exactly like them or don't necessarily, aren't with the program necessarily. And it's something that's animated me for a long time has been when I've seen people who haven't had the benefit of a Torah education to want to open those doors. And I think that it has to be a function of Avos Yisrael, has to be a function of loving other Jews. And then after that, as I also said before, it's common sense, which means don't mess it up. The Torah is a powerful product, so to speak. The Jewish community is an amazing community. And if we give people those great experiences and we just don't, it's like you open a door, don't stick your foot out to trip the person while they're walking through it. That's the Hippocratic oath. I think they say, do no harm, right? And that's so much of what it is. It's, common, I think it was Voltaire, they quoted, says that common sense is not so common. And unfortunately, if you see, you watching these parody videos on online about how people, sort of the missteps that people take when they're dealing with less observant Jews and how people become so confused as to how to relate to people who are just people, and it's people who just happen to not have grown up with a religious background. It's not that complicated, but people, sometimes make it complicated, and we can make mistakes, and we can say things that are insensitive, or we can say things that we can push people too hard, like Mrs. Freundel alluded to, and we can do things that just mess up the process that they otherwise would be going through. So I think we're inspiring others. If we love them and we open the doors, we make the connections for people, we give them the opportunity, and then we get out of the way and just don't trip them up. Don't give them reason to exit because of something, untoward that I do or that I say. Just clear the pathway for them. Then that's the greatest, the shortest distance to their own growth, to their inspiration.
Thank you so much. Mrs. Heller?
Thank you. I believe that the start of inspiring others is to value them for exactly who they are, to really see them, to understand them, to know them, to hear them, and then to validate them. I think that everyone needs to be validated, to feel cared for, to be respected and treated with dignity before there can be growth and change. So for example, at Sulam, our first goal is to provide students who've often experienced a lot of failure with a team of educators who are supportive, who are caring and reflective of the talents and capabilities of our students. In essence, we become their biggest fans and their cheerleaders. And with that, I have seen students who have experienced extreme failure, who have been acting out in all sorts of negative ways, who are disrespectful of others because they feel disrespected. I've seen those students with the most challenging behaviors turn around after some time, sometimes even if it takes a couple of years, because they've experienced that kind of caring, of having a team of supporters who've really reflected their goodness, and they then become these generous, kind-hearted, successful human beings who are on a growth trajectory that is just exponential. And all it took was relentless support, this caring and this love, no matter what the behavior. Another very important ingredient to support growth and change in another person, I think, is to allow for their own personal agency. As humans, we're born with an innate desire to grow and learn, which continues at an incredible rate until about the age of 5. And then at that age, children attend school, and they typically lose some of their personal agency. Schools are places where rules have to be followed, and for good reason. But if we're not very, very, very careful, students can lose their sense of empowerment and agency. We're living in a world now where there's so much uncertainty. There's an expression for the current world, it's called a Vuca World. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. It's actually an army expression, and it's an acronym for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. We simply can't keep up with all the changes in the requirements for academic knowledge. We can't teach students all the academic knowledge that they need to function in this world. So all we can do is teach them to have agency, to become resourceful, independent thinkers who are constantly redefining what they need to know and learn. They need to be resilient, and they need to have grit, and they need to find ways to function in a world just living on their own agency. Having that kind of agency creates people who are able to be reflective and growth-oriented and growth-minded, and hopefully are inspired to make change. We have to help people discover their purpose in life. What is their why? This is the fundamental message from Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning. I'm sure most everybody here has read the book, but if you haven't, I really highly recommend it. I think that we have to provide very strong role models and a support network in whatever area of growth and change a person is seeking. I think that when you find a goal that you want to move towards, finding a network and a group of people who are same-minded can be extremely helpful. I think that we have to practice gratitude daily as an action. to actively say thank you out loud, that we all, for all that we've been given by Hashem, for those things that we know about, for those things that we don't know about, but to be actively and intentionally thankful all the time. And of course, help people establish that deep connection with Hashem is probably the ultimate way to help a person develop that growth and change mindset. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rabbi Lerner.
So carrying on from Lianne Heller and others who've spoken before. So I think that I think the key here is unconditional acceptance, meaning that if you want to be able to be makarev someone to whatever you want them to be, whatever you're trying to do, unless you're willing to just be unconditionally accepting and loving of a person, it's not going to work. So that's feature number one. The other thing is that, we live in a time when there are so many products competing for market share. So one of the things that I can tell you is, from my experience in consulting in the business world, is product separation these days. A lot of it has to do with who's selling you the product. That one product might be the same almost as another, but if the salesman or saleswoman is good enough, they'll make the product that they want to sell you, the one that you want to buy. So they also have to be somewhat inspired by what they're selling, but it also has to do with the ability of a person to sell a product. Finally, though, I think the most important thing, and I think this was brought home to me a number of years ago by our oldest son, Neil. So many, many years ago, post-high school, after he had spent his first post-high school year in yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, and then he was shopping to see where he wanted to settle down in yeshiva. And he was going to various yeshivas, whatever. And then he calls me one day and says, Abba, I decided, where I want to be. I thought, great. What caused you to make the decision? Now, remember, he had been sitting in on shiurim. He had been sitting in on, he had been in the Batei Midrashim. And so I said, what caused you to come to this conclusion? So he said, well, the Rosh Yeshiva of that particular yeshiva invited me to come for Shabbos this past Shabbos. And I saw how he and his wife interact, and I saw how they interact with their children. And when I saw how he interacted with his wife and she with him and they with their children, I knew that I wanted him to be my Rebbe. And that actually, for me, brought home a lot, because I think that whether it's the successes that in humility Rabbi Karetsky talks about, or the successes that any of us talk about, it's really about people seeing how we behave, how we interact, that just like your children are always observing your behavior, always, like the kids are constantly recording audio and video of what's going on around them in the house. Never, the one thing, guys, that frustrates me so much is when parents talk about their children in front of their children and assume the kid ain't listening. What are you doing? Anyway, that's a separate message for a different time. But the bottom line is that those who we want to bring closer are observing us, our behavior, how we react, how we interact with each other, how we interact with them. If we're role modeling exactly what we're selling, then we will make the sale.
Thank you. This is, you each have given, I can only speak for myself. I'm confident that many feel the same, given us so much to think about in terms of the topic of inspiration. I could sit here a long time more But I just want to ask each of you one more question. We'll ask different questions to different panelists, but I think this is a unique opportunity, and I just want to give people a drop more. Mrs. Freundel, you actually began by speaking about your mother, which was just a beautiful thing to think about. Obviously, you're still working and interacting with people today. Would you say that the formula has changed over the years? Would you say it's the exact same formula? If it's changed, how would you say it's changed?
You know, it's interesting that you asked that question, because the answer in a very Jewish way is yes and no. On one hand, human nature is human nature. And even in the Tanakh, we see people doing the kinds of things that we still either glory in today or suffer through today. On the other hand, you know, the zeitgeist today is full of sort of short spurts of things. It's full of media. It's full of everybody having to weigh in. You know, even 40 years ago, if somebody was looking to hire a rabbi, there was a search committee. There weren't surveys and focus groups and everything else. And that kind of has changed. I was speaking with an educator early today who reminded me that even in education, ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. And then I reminded her that that's true to an extent, but I suspect that Judaic studies teachers in past eras, even during pandemics, didn't have to contend with remote learning and all the problems with students on Zoom platforms. So is the basic formula the same? Yes. Are human beings the same? In a very fundamental way, yes. And at the same time, we live in a very different world because of a large part because of the technological revolution, because of the pandemic, because we live in a post 9/11 world. But the basic principles are the basic principles. HaKadosh Baruch Hu laid them out for us in the Torah. And so the basic principles remain the same, even if the specifics may change.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Rabbi Karetsky, you spend your day dealing with people from across the spectrum of observance. Many of the people you interact with are probably less observant than the average person on this Zoom. Could you give us one thing that as Orthodox Jews, maybe we're taking for granted, that people who aren't living in an Orthodox context are missing so much in their lives that we have day in, day out, and if only we would appreciate what we had?
So I'll say I'm conflicted a little bit about this question, because there's often a dissonance between what people actually feel that they're missing and what I think they should be missing. And sometimes it bothers me that I wish people felt more of a sense that they're lacking in intellectual clarity or in a certain moral sort of guidance, but often they don't necessarily, and that can be frustrating, because that means it's difficult to fill a lack that a person themselves do not feel. So that being said, what I do think people really are taken with, which is no less remarkable and no less important, is the sense of community that we have in the observant community, in the observant world. It's astounding, really, and it's something I think we take so much for granted. I bring students all the time for Shabbatons. I bring students to Jewish weddings. Some people may have seen me parading around with groups of college students at random local weddings, and they're amazed by these experiences. First of all, by the spirit of it and the dynamism, which is something that's entirely really shocking to most of them. But also the whole notion that strangers are welcoming people in, that on a Shabbos there's children flowing in and out all day, that there's, unmediated real connections between people. It's what I think, sociologists call this like thick community, right? As opposed to what goes on today is so much, there's thin community on the web, and our virtual interactions are very superficial. They're very, just very shallow in a certain way. And the thickness of our lives, of our communities, during great times, during difficult times, during all times, during routine times, it's really incredible. And it's a profound testament to, to who we are, people. I mean, they just can't believe it. And again, while in a certain sort of pure abstract intellectual sense, sometimes that bothers me. Like, why aren't people more occupied with the, more existential questions of life and things of that nature? But this generation is more concerned about belonging and about, connection to other people, especially in a world that is that makes real connections so difficult. And so I think that is one area that we don't have to even attempt to highlight it. It's just so bolate. It's so self-evident. The power of our community, the interconnectivity, the love, the openness, despite all of the flaws that we know do exist within our communities, from kind of in the back of the kitchen. But the reality is, when you see it as a newcomer with a fresh set of eyes, it really is astounding, and something we can appreciate, I think, ourselves as well, even when we're in the back of the kitchen sometimes. Thank
you very much. Thank you. Mrs. Heller, you spent your day dealing with people with special needs. If there was one thing you wish that the average person on the street, or maybe the average person in our community could better appreciate or understand about those with special needs, what would you say that might be?
There's a ton that I wish I could talk about, but I'm going to focus on what I suggested at the beginning, and that is to understand the difference between people with visible disabilities and those with invisible disabilities. So people with visible disabilities are often judged just by their looks and by, unfortunately, prevailing stereotypes. So, for example, a child with Down syndrome may be met with low expectations for social understanding, for their emotional needs being met, and for their cognitive abilities. And of course, each person is different, and a disability does not define an individual. So, for example, at Sulam, we have children with visible disabilities, such as Down syndrome, who have true, meaningful friendships, who love to learn, who can daven, who connect deeply with Hashem, and who have dreams and hopes for a happy and fulfilling life that includes meaningful employment and close and loving relationships. So it's just important to be aware that when you see someone with a visible disability, that what you see is not what you get. And then on the other hand, you have people with invisible disabilities like Mike, who I described earlier this evening, and they have the opposite challenge. They often experience very negative judgment from others. Their behaviors are often reflective of some of the barriers they experience and struggle to react to life the same way as others. They struggle to react to life the same way as others do, or in generally expected ways. So from a very young age, they can get labeled as difficult, as bad kids, as oppositional, defiant, spoiled, weird. And those are just some of the kinder adjectives they hear about themselves. So since kids experience this attitude towards themselves from a very young age, from peers, from sometimes from educators, adults, etc., they often accept these judgments of themselves as true and legitimate, which you can imagine sets them up for a lifetime of real emotional challenge. So ultimately, my wish is that we would be open-hearted and generous in our judgment of everyone, and especially those who are the most vulnerable in our community, our children with disabilities. Thank you.
Very much. Rabbi Lerner, you've You've been on the front lines for a very long time. I want to say for the record, in my book, you're still cool. I think you're still cool, Rabbi Lerner, but you're still on the front lines in many ways, and you're advising people across the front lines. Do you, the similar question that I posed to Mrs. Freundel a few minutes ago, do you think the formula has changed over the years? Do you think it's the same?
I think human nature is human nature. So human nature doesn't change. But as as was said previously, Mrs. Frandell said it very well, and that is that Zoom and other issues are just different issues for our time. So, but human nature remains human nature. And if we understand that, then we also, when we learn Chumash, when we learn Tanakh, we see that human nature is human nature. So there was something that inspired me, Rabbi, sometimes you learn over something, and then you wonder how come you didn't see this years ago, or how come you didn't come across this before? And then things just come to you at a certain time and you just wonder, where did that come from? A lot of times that happens when I'm in the middle of speaking and I don't even know where that came from. And then, but it happens, So the Imri Noam, Rabbi Meir Hurwitz, who lived from 1819 to 1877, the Imri Noam was a great scholar, Kabbalist Rebbe. And it relates to the Parsha, it relates to this, it pulls it together for me in a sense. So the Imri Noam writes about what we were just reading in the Chumash. Well, actually, it's in the Rashi on the Chumash of the Pachim Ketanim, when Yaakov Avinu goes back for what? It says he's going back to retrieve what? Some like pieces of what? Like what? And so what was he retrieving? So the Imri Noam says the following. It says, when the dove came back to Noach, it had an olive branch in its mouth. And on that branch, there were olives, and they were ripe olives. And Noach saw that this branch wasn't an accident that it came to him. And so it says, according to the Imri Noam, that Noach carefully squeezed every single drop from these olives and the leaves and everything else and put it into a tiny vessel, which he then sealed. He did not know he just knew it was something supernatural that he was going to hold on to. According to the Imri Noam, Noach handed this over to Shem. It went down through the generations. And eventually it worked its way to Yaakov Avinu. Yaakov Avinu was holding this thing only knowing that it had significance because it was being handed down by ancestors. That was one of the items that was left across. He had to go back and retrieve it. Then says that Yaakov Avinu saw to it that little vessel wound up on Har HaMoriah, and that it was from that oil came the oil of Chanukah that burned for 8 days. What do we take out of this? So for me, there's a lot of Kedusha that happens in the world, and many people are unaware of it. Noach knew that there was something that even that he didn't understand, there was something here that was Kodesh. And therefore he had to hold on to it. And as he handed it down to the generations, even the people holding it who were part of the chain did not know what it would become. Yaakov Avinu knew that it was valuable and protected it. And it was a simple jug of nothing, seemingly. But that jug became the jug, which was the oil that illuminated eventually the Beis HaMikdash. I think for all of us, it's realizing that there are so many things around us that we don't see, that we don't sense are so holy, and that we miss it. We just miss these opportunities. And if we would seize these opportunities and we would hold on to them, those are the opportunities that need to be passed down the door vadar, from generation to generation, because it could very well be that one of those things will become the thing that illuminates the Beis Hamikdash, just as it can be one thing that you do or that I do that can change the entire course of the history of the world. And we don't even realize, we don't give ourselves enough credit for realizing that we're not here just by accident. We're here to do something special. And whatever it is, and sometimes we may think it's nothing, but later on we realize many years later, that thing that we didn't even think was something, that was the thing. That's what I want to leave you with, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to each of our presenters, Rabbi Dr. Ivan Lerner, Mrs. Lianne Heller, Rabbi Ari Koretzky, Mrs. Sharon Freundel. I think this was an extremely, extremely meaningful discussion. I just want to point out, I was very struck. I think the most common thing that was touched on tonight was connection to God. I think there were a variety of themes that came up in different ways, but whether gratitude to God, connection to God, and that's extremely meaningful for Chanukah. We're taught that the days of Chanukah are kedei lahodos u'lahalel, to give thanks and praise to God, whether it be that that's what we're thinking about when we're saying Hallel or Ala Nisim, whether it be just a moment of reflection when we light the candles, but whether it be the thanks to God, whether it be sort of appreciating, as has been spoken tonight, appreciating the sanctity of our own souls, appreciating the sanctity of the souls of the people in our lives. You've all given us a lot to think about for any day of the year, but particularly over Chanukah. So thank you so much to each of you, and I want to wish everyone a happy Chanukah, and thank you so much for joining us. Take care.